Hi everyone, welcome back to my lesson today. Hope you all are doing well. Hope you had a good weekend as well. I'm just going to share my screen with you. In today's lesson, we'll be discussing rounding off questions, which will be part of your IELTS speaking, part 2. In your part 2, at the end of it, the examiner might ask you to do an activity on rounding off questions. So in today's lesson, I'm going to cover rounding off questions. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Yeah, so I speaking, and my name is Shazia. Welcome to the lesson today. If you do have any questions, you can always add them in the chat box and I'll do my best to get back to you within today's lesson. A bit about today's lesson. In today's lesson, we will focus on rounding off questions. Let's start. So I hope you all know a bit about rounding off questions. If you don't, this lesson will give you an idea. Yep, so we're doing rounding off questions. Rounding off questions, this part of the IELTS often surprises people because it's a bit unexpected. IELTS speaking is just before the part 3, and the students aren't prepared for it because they spend a lot of time preparing and on the actual part 2, and then they're a bit taken back by, oh, we've got this extra bit to do. So obviously these questions will be asked at the end of part 2, but before the part 3 of the IELTS discussion begins. So IELTS speaking part 2 is the talk, or sometimes called the long run. So after your 2-minute talk, the examiner may ask you 1 or 2 very basic questions. These are the rounding off questions about your part 2 content. The examiners will call these questions the rounding off questions. So for example, it might be describe your favourite form of public transport. So let's say you described trains. The questions could be, are the trains cheap in your city? Did you travel to the test today by train? And what we want you to do is just give simple answers. And this is the only part of the test where you can actually give simple answers. So the answer to the first question could be, so let's just look at the questions. Are the trains cheap in your city? Did you travel to the test today by train? And let's look. So we've put yes, about £3 for a single journey. And no, actually I came by taxi. For the second question. What the examiner wants to move on to part 3 quickly as possible, so they don't want you to take a lot of time on these rounding off questions. They just want you to be really simple with them. So don't worry if the examiner doesn't ask these questions as well. It means that the total timing for part 2 has reached 3 minutes. This is usually a positive thing because it means your part 2 is quite long. So they might not require to ask you the rounding off questions, but you always need to be prepared just in case. There are usually 2 rounding off questions. The questions usually are, do you think? Or what do you think? Will there be? Why? Some. These are the way the questions will be set out to start off. So they could start off with, do you think? What do you think? Will there be? Why? Some. The questions will be based on the cue cards that you already have. So you'll have 1 minute to prepare and make notes if you wish. And then the examiner asks 1 or 2 rounding off questions. Examples of some questions are, is it valuable in terms of money? Or would it be easy to replace? Sorry, I'm just going to have a look if anyone's got any questions. I'm just going to type something in the chat box. Yep, so these could be an example of the 2 questions. So try to answer the question by using these phrases, I believe that, or in my opinion. So if you memorize these 2 phrases, number 1, I believe that, or number 2, in my opinion, because you can start off any answer using either of these 2, I believe that, or in my opinion. So avoid using I think that, because I think, the word think is very simple and it's probably most likely going to be in your question. So the examiner most likely will begin with what do you think, or do you think type of question. So you don't want to use the same word as what they'll use, because that'll just be a repetition of what they are using. So if that makes sense, that you want to start off with the phrases like I believe that, or in my opinion, because these are actually really good phrases to memorize to answer them simple questions. Yet, because think is the word that the examiner is most likely to use in their question. So what you don't want to do is use the same word as them. So you don't want to reply with I think that. So always memorize that I believe that, or in my opinion, because they are actually really good phrases. So I really recommend that memorize the 2 phrases, and then you can actually answer them simple questions using any of them 2 phrases. Yeah, so again, what you don't want is to repeat their own words, the examiner's own words. You want to show confidence by using words, your own words. So memorize the different phrases to answer the questions. So another good example is as per as I am concerned, or as far as I am concerned. So if you just memorize the simple phrases that you can answer any question by, because they actually are phrases that you can use with any type of questions, simple questions. Bear in mind when the question begins with any of these, so do, so do you like something, is, or has it. So any questions that begin with these words like do, is, or has it. So you need to start your answer with yes or no. So remember, any of these do, is, has it. any question, any of the rounding off questions that begin with these words, you need to start your answer with yes or no. So if the answer is yes, I would say, yep, yes, I believe that. Yep, you need to start it off with yes and then put a comma and I believe that, and then you can put the reason for your answer. Or you could put yes, in my opinion, and then start your answer. If the answer is no, then you can say no, I believe that, and a extra. So if it's no, in my opinion. Yep. So as long as you remember the two phrases, you can actually answer any of the questions. Example of a cue card. So let's look at some examples. I've done a few examples from recent IELTS. So this is an example of the cue card. Describe a recent holiday. You should say when it was, where you went, what you did there, and why you enjoyed it. So this will be the cue card that you'd see, and these will be the questions in speaking part 2. And at the end, you'll have some rounding off questions. That depends if you do get them, but not to worry if you don't. If you do, this would be the example of the questions from the recent test. Would you ever go there again? Would you recommend other people to go on a similar holiday? So these would be your 2 questions. And you will only see the rounding off question at the end of completing the part 2. So once you've completed the part 2, then you'll know. So you won't know what questions you're going to get for the rounding off part 2 until you've completed the actual part 2 task. Then they'll appear. So you haven't really got much time to prepare for them. This is an example of another cue card that I've actually extracted from a recent IELTS test. So the cue card says, describe one of your friends that is similar to you. You should say who the person is, what the person is like, how you are similar to each other, and how you feel about the person. The rounding off questions that you'll get are, do you like spending time with that person? What do you usually do together? Yep. So this is another example of one of the recent cue cards. So that'll be the cue card. And don't forget the rounding off questions you won't be able to see until you've completed the actual task. So once you've completed that cue card, that's when they'll give you the rounding off questions. I'm just going to see if you've put any comments in the chat box. I'm just going to reply to some of your comments. Yep, so that's another example of one of the cue cards. So the task actually is to describe one of your friends that is similar to you. And then the questions are who the person is, what the person is like, how you are similar to each other, and how you feel about the person. And then after you've completed the task, you'll see 2 rounding off questions. Number 1, do you like spending time with that person? Number 2, what do you usually do together? And remember, they just want really simple answers. Another example, this is actually taken from a recent IELTS speaking test as well. So the question was, describe a time when you were disheartened. You should say when it was, where you were, what happened to make you feel disheartened, and what you should do differently if it happened again. The rounding off questions. Does this type of situation often happen to you? What do you do to feel better after you've been disheartened? The rounding off questions won't be on your cue card. So the reason why I keep bringing this to your attention is that when I've put it together, you might get confused and you might think that they come together on the cue card. Actually, the cue card will have your task and the questions to do with the task, and then the rounding off questions would come through after you've completed the task. So this is another example of a cue card. So it's describe a time when a family member asked for help. You should say when it was, who asked for help, how you helped, how you felt about it. And the rounding off questions could be, have you ever helped a stranger? Do you support any charities in your country? So to answer these questions, the first one, have a quick think. Have you ever helped a stranger? Meaning you've helped someone you don't know. So you can answer the question by saying, yes, I do it all the time. Whenever I see someone in need on the street, I help beggars by giving them food or money. That would give you a high score, just giving a simple answer like that, where you've used, you know that they've asked you a question, have you ever helped a stranger? You know it's a simple answer they require, and you want to fit in the answer to it is yes. You want to say that you do it all the time if someone's in need, and you've said how you've helped strangers or you help strangers. Obviously in the answer I've put, on the street I help beggars by giving them food or money. Or I could have answered that question by saying, yes, if an elderly person struggles to get on and off the bus, I always give them a hand. So here that you could answer it with any of them two answers. And also you, instead of elderly, you could put a person with a disability struggles to get on and off the bus. I always give them a hand. So that's what they're looking for, that you have the basic understanding, you grasp a simple question and you can just give them a simple answer. And they don't want you to drag the answer out, they want you to give a simple answer to the simple question. Just going to have a look if anybody has put any comments as well. It's fine. So you could also add in, yes, it gives me so much joy to be able to help others. And for the question 2, so let's just go back and recap so you don't forget the questions. Have you ever helped a stranger? That was the first question. And the answer to that was, we could say, yes, I do it all the time. Whenever I see someone in need on the street, I help beggars by giving them food or money. Or you can also use yes if an elderly person struggles to get on and off the bus. I always give them a hand. And remember, with that question, you can answer it with, it gives me so much. Yes, it gives me so much joy to be able to help others. So you can always end your question using that phrase. Do you support any charities in your country? So this is question 2. So you can answer by saying, yes, I do. I try to give clothes and money to charity once a year. Yep, so rounding off questions is very simple. What we don't want you to do is complicate it for yourself. So you need to remember that the questions are very simple and they require a simple answer to them. So let's go back and look at some more, and then it hopefully gives you an idea. So the task was, describe a time when you were disheartened. You should say when it was, where you were, what happened to make you feel disheartened, and what you would do differently if it happened again. And then the rounding off questions were, does this type of situation often happen to you? So they are referring to the situation when you were disheartened. Does it often happen? So you could say yes, and then you could answer the question, yes, I believe that I often get into this situation because, and then you can actually just add on why. Or you could say no, and then answer your question and keep it as simple as possible. And then the second question, what do you do to feel better after you've been disheartened? Again, you need to keep that really simple and not adding, so you're not giving a long description of what you would do. Just something simple. It could be like you have a cup of coffee, or you visit your parents, or you watch your favorite movie, or you listen to music. So try to aim to just keep it simple and just provide possibly one thing that you do. Yep, so remember the questions won't be on your cue card. Let's just look at the next one. Describe a time when a family member asked for help. You should say when it was, who asked for help, how you helped, how you felt about it. So this would be your task, which we're not actually discussing in detail, the actual task in today's lesson, because we're trying to focus on the rounding off the questions. So we will actually come back to the actual task in a different lesson. Let's just concentrate on rounding off the questions. So for that one, it's have you ever helped a stranger? And do you support any charities in your country? So it will just say 1 and 2 for your questions. And just to let you know, there might be a time when you're going through the test and you only get one of the answers, because they might feel like it's not a requirement. They don't need you to answer a the second question, so you might only get one question. It is rare, but it can happen, just to let you know, but don't worry about it if you just get one question. Obviously, if you just get the one question, answer the question. Keep it short, keep it simple. Make sure you just stick to the bullet point and answer the question. So let's just imagine we only get one of the questions. So we get the question saying, have you ever helped a stranger? So we can answer it, yes, I do it all the time. Whenever I see someone in need on the street, I help beggars by giving them food or money. If anyone's stuck on any of the rounding off questions from the IELTS, or anyone who's recently been for the IELTS and could share some examples, that would be great. So if you share them in the chat box, any rounding off questions that you feel stuck with, or any questions that you remembered from the previous test, please do comment them in the chat box, because I'll keep referring to the chat box during this lesson and answering all of your questions. I'll just have a look there, that's fine. So let's just refocus on the rounding off questions that actually often surprise people because it's just so unexpected. Because I suppose everyone's busy preparing for the speaking part 2, the actual task, and then they're busy preparing, which is totally understandable that you're busy preparing for the part 3 and you miss that part, so it just comes as an unexpected, so you never expected it, it just comes really unexpected to you. So obviously remember that they'll be asked at the end of part 2, so once you've completed the task, then they'll come up with the 2 questions with, but obviously remember that they'll be before the part 3, so if you've already been given the part 3, it just means that they've decided that you don't require to do them rounding off questions, which is fine. It just means that you've achieved what their expectations were. Yeah, so the reason why we say the examiner may ask you, because at times the examiner may not ask you the rounding up of questions, so don't be worried if you're not asked. Let's look at these questions again and let's try to focus. So this one was, the main task was about public transport, and your 2 rounding off questions from the main task were, so the main task was you were describing trains, and the 2 rounding off questions that were given were, are the trains cheap in your city? Did you travel to the test today by train? So let's just focus on these. So what you need to do is focus on the first question. Are the trains cheap in your city? So that's just a short question, a simple question, and what they want is just a simple answer. So the answer for that would be yes, about £3 for a single journey. So what are you saying? The answer is that yes, it's the trains are cheap in your city. So you're answering yes to that, and then you've just quoted the price for a single journey. And the second question, did you travel to the test today by train? And then obviously you just give a simple answer, no, actually I came by taxi. Because the examiner wants to move on to the part 3 quickly as possible, you don't want to take a long time answering them questions. They just want you to round off the questions and give a simple answer. So yep, remember the questions usually are, so they begin with any of these type of phrases. Do you think? What do you think? Will there be? Why some? And obviously the questions will be based on the topic that the cue card is set on. So you'll have your cue card and then you'll actually complete that task, and then the round off questions will just be based on that. So just answer them simple as possible, and just try to memorize the two phrases that we discussed earlier in the lesson. So number one, I believe that, in my opinion, and also the other two, as far as I am concerned, or as per as I'm concerned, I am concerned. So obviously any of them phrases, if you just memorize them phrases and memorize them so that you know that these phrases are to do with the rounding off questions. So memorize the phrases and then put them aside and think these are for the rounding off questions, and then you won't be under any pressure when you do get them questions. And try not to repeat any words that are in the question. So the examiner sets the question. Don't repeat their words back to them. So obviously if it begins with do you think, you don't want to put yes, I do think, because you're just giving the answer using the question. So they don't want to see that and they don't like seeing that. So you actually just need to memorize the phrases that we discussed. I believe that, and in my opinion. So if you just memorize the phrases and just simply answer the questions. And also with any questions that do begin with do, is, or has it, remember that you just need to answer with, you need to begin your answer with a yes or a no. So if you just memorize do, is, has it, and you just memorize that it's associated with the answer beginning with a yes or a no. Just going to have a look if anyone's got any questions on today's lesson. I won't be a second. Remember, the lesson is live, just to remind you. So you can ask me any questions now and I can get back to you. And if not, I will be checking next week on Saturday, because my lessons are every Saturday at 2 p.m. So just make sure that you do join my lessons. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, because we've actually spent a lot of time focusing on rounding off questions, which is part of your speaking IELTS speaking part 2, which is at the end of your part 2 and but before your part 3. So with your rounding off questions, you can answer by saying yes. Always use the yes. So I hope this lesson has given you some ideas on rounding off questions. Please practice the answers and remember the basic answer phrases as you can use the same ones to answer any questions. So the ones we discussed, that I believe that, in my opinion, and as far as I am concerned, as per as I am concerned. If you memorize these phrases, you can use these to answer any of the rounding off questions. Obviously, remember whether you need to begin the answer with yes or no. Hope you enjoyed today's lesson. If you do have any questions, comment them in the chat box. I'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves. Thank you.